Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm Mike Jr. II, and today we're going to be covering more topics on the RetroPie. If you haven't already, I recommend you watch my previous video on the RetroPie. If you don't know what the RetroPie is, it's basically an interface for the small computer known as the Raspberry Pi that lets you play a wide variety of emulators. In the video, I tested emulators for a good chunk of the RetroPie on the Raspberry Pi 3 and also checked out a variety of its features. The video did outstanding, at least for my channel. I want to personally thank all of those who watched and enjoyed the video. There's still some stuff I haven't covered for the RetroPie though, so for today we're going to look over experimental emulators for the RetroPie on the Raspberry Pi 3. I was originally going to be making a large video in the same structure as the first one, covering more on the device that I missed, including going over bettering N64 emulation or talking about the MAME emulator for arcade games. I will be going over this stuff in future videos, so don't worry. But today we're specifically going to go over newer consoles that I didn't talk about in the previous video. That includes the Nintendo DS, Sony PSP, and Sega Dreamcast. And because I talk too much, I will put timestamps on the screen and in the description for you guys to skip to certain parts of the video. Some of you may only care about certain emulators, so I'd like to give you the option to go straight to those points. Just know you may miss little details from the whole video that might give out some extra context. I would put annotations too, but YouTube got rid of those recently and I'm not sure cars will work the same way. So just in case they don't, you'll have to skip yourself or use the description. Before I start, I do want to say that none of my feelings on emulation I cover today or in future videos replace my thoughts on my first RetroPie video. I still think the device is a fantastic emulation machine and should be the go-to machine if you want anything PlayStation 1 and before when talking about home consoles and handhelds. As said, we'll go over arcade emulation on the Pi in a future video as well. I also had some complaints about the first video's thumbnail calling it the best emulation machine ? And people pointing out that many other devices can run emulation better. I won't deny that the thumbnail was a little clickbaity and had a question I never answered in the video. I made it after making the video, so my bad there. I'll refrain from using thumbnails like that in the future. I mean, I didn't have any red circles or arrows on it, and every game I put in the thumbnail, like the obvious Mario 64, was playable on the device. I still stand by that it's a great emulation machine though, as it runs plenty of different consoles, has lots of features, and costs far less than almost every other emulation machine out there. Is it the absolute best? No. The best emulation machine is the best computer with the most compatible parts for whatever you want to emulate. At the end of the day, play emulation how you want on the device of your choice. In my opinion, the Raspberry Pi 3/RetroPie hit the sweet spot of price, compatibility, and features. Oh, and because I had a question about this in the last video, the settings on my Elgato when recording from the Pi were all zeroed out. I usually do this because it gives me the most freedom to mess with the color and sharpness in Movie Studio Platinum. This is to make games look more appealing to people watching my Let's Plays or Mic Jams On. However, I didn't want to do that with the RetroPie video because it would falsely represent how games look on the device. The example LPs and Mic Jams On from that video also didn't have any enhancing in them, besides maybe the stretching, but that was from the Pi itself. Though my Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories LP, which is being played off the Pi, has been enhanced. I still kept these settings as 0 for the review. That made the black sides look slightly grayish, and that's not how it's supposed to look. I'm not sure if it would be better to change the settings on the Elgato or keep it the way it is. For now, I'm going to keep them zeroed, but please leave a comment on what you think would better represent the RetroPie and possibly any other device in the future. And just to let you guys know, for this video I'm using version 4.1 of the RetroPie. And it should be said that after I got done recording this video, I found out that there was version 4.2 of the RetroPie. The update apparently fixes some issues with DS emulation. I will test this out myself in the future to see if this fixes anything below. However, for this update and any future update, if there's anything that's actually fixed in newer versions, feel free to leave it in the comments below. Moving on now, to actually play both DS and Dreamcast games, we will have to download the emulators from the RetroPie setup in the RetroPie menu. Then go to Manage Packages. With your hazmat suit on, go to the Experimental Packages and download from Source or Binary Drastic for DS. In the Manage Optional Packages, you will need to do the same with Rycast for the Dreamcast. The PSP emulator is already on the RetroPie, so you won't have to add anything there. The PSP already has the BIOS files installed too, which is really odd, but hey, that's less for us to do. You will still need the BIOS files for the Dreamcast and the Nintendo DS, and they need to go into the BIOS folder of your device. Just for a recap to newbies, BIOS files is a specific code that will make games and hardware run like they should on the original device. Emulation is already a program trying to mimic hardware, but BIOS files will help it mimic the hardware even better for the closest emulation. Most emulators can avoid the necessity of the BIOS files from good programmers making their own, which can often be even better than the original, though it may take the emulation machine being more powerful for that to work. The Pi is a low-budget, cost-effective computer, so it lacks the power to run PS1 era and beyond emulation without the original BIOS files. Issue is, most are copywritten, which means that distribution of them is illegal. Because of that, I cannot and will not give you the location to find them. You're on your own. With that out of the way, let's get into what you're all waiting for, the emulators. The most successful handheld and second most successful console of all time, the Nintendo DS. So in the last video, I said the benchmark for what the Pi 3 can emulate ends before the PlayStation 2, but I never really got into what it was for handhelds and stopped before the DS. When it comes to LR emulators, the ones with the fancy settings, the DS ends at Desume, a pretty popular emulator for DS games on normal PCs. I believe it's the same one I use for playing Naruto Path of the Ninja and Mega Man Star Force on my channel. They're old and my editing was terrible, so please don't watch them. The emulator is not at full speed on the Pi, so I figured there was no use in testing it. However, something that was either later updated or I just didn't catch, there is an emulator that runs the DS at full speed. Drastic isn't an emulator I've heard before, but apparently it runs DS games pretty well on the Pi, so I can't pass up the chance to check it out. You will need 2 BIOS files in the BIOS folder of the Pi for Drastic DS emulation to work. Let's try Kirby Superstar. Oh shit. Was that the Warp Star or the Hydra? When they said emulation was at full speed, they meant it. In all seriousness though, this isn't rendered in-game, it's just a video being played on the DS. The compression for this game's videos are terrible, so don't blame the emulation for that. The videos play at the beginning of each game, and it looks like most of them run at something like double or triple the speed here. Actual gameplay though is pretty solid. The game seems to be running without too much if any lag. There are some visual glitches in the transition between areas, but nothing during gameplay. Though it has to be said, what is it with the weird controls again? Okay, so the default emulation controls can be changed to anything that it detects from your controller, so it's already better than the GBSP's joystick-only option. However, for the start and select buttons, they are mapped to the trigger buttons, while to my knowledge, the actual start and select buttons do nothing, so why put them on the triggers? Though, if you want to use the touchpad, you can move the on-screen stylus with the left control stick, which I like. You can also plug in a mouse and use that to use touchscreen controls as well. Here's my recommended setup for Drastic. Change Select and Start to Select and Start, enter the menu with the left trigger, and change stylus controls to either joystick and use R3 or L3 buttons to tap the screen. For the position of the screens, you can either have them stacked on top, side by side, or just one. Most games use both screens in an extensive way, so just one screen would probably only work on Mario 64 DS or something. Personally, I like to see as much of the game as possible on my TV, so I like side to side. Also note, the only way to exit the emulator is by going into the menu, so don't lock yourself out of it, or you'll have to unplug your Pi. For more options, you do have save states and the ability to hotkey other settings in the menu. One thing I couldn't find was how the internal clock worked, and I found no information on it. In Pokemon White, it was telling me I was playing at 10 PM when I was actually playing at around 3 PM, so I'm not sure if it runs off some internal clock in the Pi. If anyone can give me some info on this, I'd be pleased to hear it. Mostly because Animal Crossing and even some Pokemon events will be a pain to run without it. Alrighty then, back to the games. Star Force 2 seems pretty solid. The 2D world sections and 3D fights look amazing. Apparently you can also make it look a little better with the help of high resolution texture settings. I'll show you more comparisons of other games, but I have to say that personally the higher resolution is actually really impressive. I think it even makes 2D elements look sharper as well. Now for a full 3D game, let's play some Phantom Hour. I said let's play some Phantom... Okay, let's try a different ROM. Okay, so this game is broken and I'm not sure why. It starts for half a second and then kicks me back to the RetroPie. So either the emulation is having trouble or Link's gotten good at fighting pirates. I couldn't find a solution to, so I'll leave that as a warning that some games can't work at all. For the ultimate/only 3D test, let's do some Mario 64 DS. It runs pretty well for what it's worth. I don't feel any lag in the gameplay, and the game looks nice, even better with the advanced textures. Now, a common criticism in this game is that it's a 3D game being controlled on a D-pad. With this emulation though, we can change the settings to allow it to work off the joystick. And it's underwhelming. You can clearly feel the joystick controls being converted to a D-pad. It still lacks the fluid motion of the normal joystick that makes Mario 64 such a blast to play. You can also control the movement in the game with the touchscreen, and hell no, not with this setup. This is impossible as the touchscreen won't remember your button press outside the bottom screen, so you just stop immediately. Trying to stay in the bottom screen is hard, even when you're not platforming. Though knowing this, I'm glad Phantom Hourglass doesn't work, as that's how you control that game. Sorry if you thought this emulation could fix that joystick issue. But it's still damn good emulation, with no frame rate issues, and looks great. Last but not least, let's play some Pokemon games. First up, Soul Silver. Gen 2 was such a good generation for Pokemon, and this remake really puts it to life with the Gen 4 engine. The biggest issue though is that the engine is really slow, so people either stay for Gen 2 or leave because of Gen 4. For the emulation though, it's pretty decent. There's no lag in or out of Pokemon battles. The game's opening sequence does have a few visual glitches, and in-game you will see some issues with black dots on and around 3D models. Though, funny enough, the high-resolution textures actually make those a lot smaller and harder to see, along with it just looking better. I only got to the first 2 towns in this game, so I'm not sure if the larger 3D areas have more technical issues. From what I saw though, the rest of the game can't be too bad. I already have a capture card, but I'd honestly consider using this for ROM hacks of the Pokemon series. Now for some Pokemon White. This is probably my second favorite Pokemon generation, as the story, gameplay, and overall look was incredibly done. Oh, and TMs are infinite. Fuck yeah! I didn't do a comparison with the higher resolution textures here and just kept them on. I saw very little graphical issues, so it seems fine. The whole black dots weren't even a thing, and the intro didn't have any problems either. I did notice that the emulator got a little crazy when it came to the game's speed, but I never heard or felt any lag in the game, so I have to say from what I've seen, this game's emulation is perfect. Again, speed may be an issue, but if you don't feel it, then is it really an issue? Overall, the emulation is pretty amazing. The BIOS files really make the difference here, as the game runs pretty comparable to the originals. Sure, there might be a bug here and lack of compatibility there, but when something that wasn't even running at full speed can now run a good collection of games for the DS, you have to give credit where credit is due. I wouldn't play any intense touchscreen games though. Well, at least without a mouse. It'll be awkward trying to do that with the joystick. I actually tried this myself with the touchscreen minigames in Kirby Superstar Ultra. You can't give out the same reaction time when you have to slowly move the cursor over it and then hit it. A mouse will be necessary. For less touchscreen intensive games, the joystick is convenient for the ability to use touchscreen without the need for a mouse. Luckily, most games like Pokemon and Star Force never forced the touchscreen for menus and gameplay. They always allowed you to use just the D-pad. Some minigames and mechanics will force it, but in the heat of battle or when doing item management, you don't need it. That still doesn't save it from the fact that it's not perfect though, and shouldn't be your go-to emulator for DS games. Graphical issues and the possibility that some games won't work at all will keep it far from what you can find on PC. However, if you already have a Pi and all you really want is to easily play most DS games on the big screen, then I can still recommend it. I know Pokemon alone is going to sell this emulator to a lot of people. The PlayStation Portable. I can't really call the PSP a popular console. It sold decently well, even more than the Game Boy Advance from the looks of it, but it never really had a fantastic lineup of games unless you were a JRPG fan. Some people even told me that the PSP was a better alternative than the Pi for an emulation machine. This thing has been hacked to death and people have put some damn good emulators on it. But I wouldn't say it's better than the Pi 3. I only ever got decent emulation from Genesis and NES games. Super Nintendo and my PSP 2000 just didn't cut it for me. Back to the PSP itself though, I only ever owned like 5 physical games for the whole console and bought a bunch of games online later, such as Persona. As soon as I heard there was a PSP emulator on the Pi, the only thing I could think of was Monster Hunter. I've always wanted to get into the Monster Hunter games on the PSP, but the lack of a control stick camera has always turned me off, and I could never get a hacked PSP to take inputs from a separate controller. However, looking at the compatibility list on GitHub, which shows tons of games that have been tested, it wasn't good. What got me to use it, however, was seeing that Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai Another Road, fuck that's a mouthful, worked on the emulator. A game which I owned, but somehow the UMD for it broke and I could never finish it. So now I can play this game again. The story takes place in future Trunks' world, where Majin Buu is trying to be revived. Keep in mind this is way before Super, so it's not canon. Trunks then brings his friends from the past to help him out, and it gets pretty fanfiction crazy. They bring in movie characters, have clones, and the Z-Warriors make the same mistakes they did in the original. Idiots. It still has charm, and the gameplay is pretty solid for me. And the emulation is actually damn good for this too. It's an LR emulator, which really surprised me. The PSP had a weird resolution size though, so feel free to turn on integer scaling in the video settings if you're bothered by the stretching. As much as I don't mind stretching 4x3 games to 16:9, I can't stand the stretching here. Overall, the emulation for this game is nice. The only time it ever chugged is during the super moves. Since we don't actually have to input anything during those segments, I don't see the lag as that big of a deal here. Watch out for save states on here though. It's not that they don't work, but sometimes they take forever. Well, we might as well try it. Monster Hunter Freedom Unite. This is the best version of Monster Hunter 2, and considered by many Monster Hunter fans as the best game in the entire series. For the emulation though, it's pretty hard to play. Integer scaling or not, doesn't matter, the text is super difficult to read. Second up, the lag is so horrible. The frame rate is pretty bad in the main hub, and when out in the field it's mostly okay, but still noticeable. Maybe it's just because we're blowing up a PSP game to a big size, but a lot of the extra detail just looks weird. At the end of the day, I wouldn't play this off the Pi. For the last game, we're going to check out the remake to Persona 1. I've always been ready to get into the Persona series, despite my long list of RPGs to play. However, after I bought this game, I just didn't touch it at all. One day, Persona, one day. On the list it had issues, and honestly for most of the game you probably won't see it. The movies and the gameplay nice, the music plays right, and the frame rate is good in normal gameplay and in battles. However, the thorn here is the first-person 3D sections. You basically travel through dungeons and other areas in a third-person 3D mode. It sounds dumb, but I'm sure this was good looking for early PS1, though I feel like it loses its uniqueness with the PSP remake. It's not totally unplayable, but the frame rate dips here a lot. Even more if you start running. Also, the transitions between here and encounters is completely blacked out and lags badly. This could be hit or miss for some. If the lag is that bothersome, then you might want to skip this, as you'll see it through a good chunk of the game. Since the rest of the game that I've played runs nice, it may be worth it. I'm definitely considering playing it this way myself. So the PSP emulator overall is alright. I love the fact that it's an LR emulator, so we have all the options available, such as sizing and save states. However, whether the game works or not seems to be a big hit or miss, so there's no reason to buy the Pi just for this emulator. If you already have one though, see if a PSP game you like works and try it yourself. I would definitely look at the compatibility list beforehand. It'll often be right about games being playable or not. Then again, it said Persona had issues, and I can't say the lag bothered me that much. Definitely more playable than I read some people say N64 games were. If anything, just test the game out yourself. The Sega Dreamcast. Considered by many to be the most underrated console of all time, and Sega's last push before becoming a third-party software company. I never played the console before, but I like to think of it as the Wii U of its generation. So when it comes to home console systems, the Dreamcast is the farthest the Pi can emulate, and spoiler alert, it's not the best. Like the N64, the emulator is not a part of the LR, so you have no settings for the video, controllers, and so on. You don't even get save states here. They also made it so going back to the emulation station is just the select button, which is weird since every other emulator I've played has it as select and start, or you have to exit it from the game menu like the DS. It's caused me to exit out of a few games by accident when messing around with the buttons. So unlike most emulators, you might actually have to get into the system manager for the Dreamcast to mess with some settings. For some reason, I had an issue with saving in my games, and when I went into the system manager, it turns out my memory card had X's on them. I had to erase all the data to get them to work, so make sure you do that before playing any games you want to save in. First off, let's talk about what files you have to use. When it comes to the Dreamcast, there are two kinds of files, CDI and GDI. When burning games to an actual disc for the Dreamcast, you only use the CDI file. But when it comes to emulators, you can use either. CDI files, in my opinion, are the best to use because they're just one file. None of that renaming the .bin and ISO stuff. The same is kind of true for GDI files, but I'm not sure exactly what files are needed. I could only find a GDI version of Sonic Adventure, but had no instructions on what to do with it. I took a gamble and just put them into the folder of the Dreamcast games, and it seems like it works without any problems. Well, any unique problems. Anyway, my advice is to always use CDI files because they are simpler to use and are also smaller file sizes too. One last point to add is that this emulator has a memory leak, so the longer you play the emulation, the more it might and eventually will crash. From what I read, it's a good idea to not only exit the emulation after playing for a bit, but also turning off the Pi itself to prevent this from happening. Now to actually test out this bad boy with Sonic Adventure. Sonic's first jump into 3D, and it has its problems, but we all know it's gold compared to the future. Oh boy. For what it's worth, it seems like everything is looking like it should. Besides the FMVs that have horrible VSync issues, there are a few problems, like Sonic's eye being cut up. At first I thought this might have been normal until he did his little face thing here. I haven't run into issues of textures being placed awkwardly here or in most other games. The biggest fault with Sonic Adventure is that the frame rate is awful and chugs along like myself in a race, meaning all the time. Cutscenes or gameplay, it's just not all there. I mean, the menu is fine, I guess. Sonic Adventure 2 has less problems with models, but the frame rate is still not good enough for it to be playable, at least for me. Now to really test the 2D art, and just because I hear it's the best version of the game, Marvel vs. Capcom 2. I never played the series before, but I always wanted to get into it. I was pretty excited for this to work, and it does. Again, I'm not sure what's 100% on this or not since I've never played it. But the flow feels nice, and none of the 2D or 3D assets look like they glitch or anything. I'll definitely look into the future titles for this series. Sadly, the game does not instantly recognize a second controller, and I can't find any info on getting multiplayer to work. So this fine title is relegated to single player only. Damn shame. If there's some way to get it to work though, feel free to leave a comment. I'm sure there's a way if you bust into the code. Now for our last game, we're going to play some Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. This was also said to be one of the best versions of this game, and I can't lie when I say it plays great. The flow of the game is good, so no frame rate issues. The FMV cutscenes do have the same problem as Sonic Adventure, being all cut up. The only problem is Tony Hawk is so amazing his shadow cannot correctly form and is stretched all around the floor to not disrespect his majesty. Or that's a glitch, you know, either or. FYI, I was never great at these games, so feel free to laugh at my footage. Overall, the Dreamcast emulation is hit or miss, but I was still pleasantly surprised. The games that run well run pretty great. The games that don't do have a lot of problems, and I would definitely call them unplayable. That, and the fact that the emulator lacks save states, I can't in good faith tell people to buy the Pi for the Dreamcast emulation. If the games you like work, then feel free to get it for that, but not everything will. I also understand that it's amazing that the Pi 3 can even run Dreamcast games. I won't deny it, this little machine has got some processors. Still, that doesn't mean it's perfect. If you already have a Pi 3, then definitely check it out. If you don't and nothing else on the RetroPie intrigues you, then stay far away. And with that, we're done. I might have seemed a little negative here, especially after all the games that worked really well, but understand that they all still have flaws. For what it's worth, the emulation when it comes to software and hardware is very impressive, and you have to give credit where credit is due. It's still not perfect though, and that will keep many people from using this device as part of their gaming setup. Well, at least for these game systems. It's definitely a good thing for people who already own a Raspberry Pi 3 to check out, so go nuts. At the end of the day, it's best to use emulation on other devices for these systems. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and okay, I'm sure I'm getting some angry faces from RetroPie lovers, but yes, overclocking your Pi can give you better frame rate for Dreamcast and PSP games. However, for the review, I believe it's best to represent this from what the base Pi can do, as the speed on an overclocked Pi can vary. It's not fair to tell someone it'll work fine on a setting they can't run. Doesn't mean we're not going to talk about it though. For the next video, we're going to go over overclocking and how that helps Dreamcast, PSP, and even going back over the Nintendo 64. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will catch you guys next time. This is Mike Jr. II, signing out. Now to really test the 2D art, and just because I hear that it's the best version of the game, Marble versus Capcom, Marble. That's right, Marble versus Capcom. I could just see, you know, Capcom would make a Marble versus Capcom game. Like it's just a bunch of marble floors, and they're fighting Capcom characters. That would be a thing. No one tell me otherwise. That would fucking happen.